password. It let me right in.
All right, great. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started since I have the cheap free version. So how did you first meet Ray Bradbury?
Well, that goes back to the late 1980s. I was toward the end of my 20-year Air Force career at that time. I was a major teaching at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And a couple of my colleagues had set up a fantastic science fiction convention, and Ray Bradbury was going to be the keynote speaker for.
Cool.
And I was assigned to him for that week, and my wife and I hosted him in 1989, in the spring of 1989, in Colorado Springs. That's where we first got to know each other. It was really a wonderful experience because my expertise in my PhD was textual studies, how authors compose and then revise and publish their books, often with interference to some degree or another from editors and publishers who want to impose their own suggestions and styling and so on it. And with Ray Bradbury, you have an author who also continues to revise and tinker with many of his texts down through time. So it was wonderful for me, and it was fascinating for him to meet someone that wasn't going to ask him all the same questions again, like what does fire mean in Fahrenheit 451, you know, that kind of stuff. Because I was interested in the young writer he had once been. And it turns out that really since the 1960s, he, for the rest of his life, he was also very fascinated with that young writer he had once been. And the further he grew away in time from that writer, the more fascinated he became with that writer's voice and the wonderful things that he published really through the 50s and into the early 60s, those books and stories that have such staying power. So we stayed in touch, and actually, I began to work with him on building a fairly comprehensive list of how those stories changed and documenting everywhere they were published and the titles that changed and the revisions he made. And he put me in touch then with his good friend and bibliographer, Don Albright, who was an art professor at the Pratt Institute in New York. And Don was very important in collecting Ray Bradbury's work and knowing a lot about Ray Bradbury. And so over the years, I worked on some special editions with Don, and then beginning in 2004, published a critical study with Bill Tupons, my late colleague here, and then the three biography trilogy books, the last two of which have been finished since Ray passed away in 2012. So that's sort of the arc of how we got to know each other.
Okay. Yeah, because Bradbury is one of those, if you read all of his stuff or most of his stuff, you do see that he's revisiting certain things he wrote about as a young man, and certain themes kind of come back, and so he would be the ideal author for that line of work. So, well, my next question was going to be, how long have you been a fan of his? But I think you kind of answered that. But would you say you're a lifelong fan of his, or?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Orty. There's an earlier chapter to that story. Probably in 1962, I was probably 10 years old at that time. But in 1962, I came across his collection, The Golden Apples of the Sun. And what an amazing book, it was published in 1953, but it showcased so many of his stories from a wide range, some of his award-winning realism from the late 40s, his magical realism, his fantasy, his science fiction, and that title story, The Golden Apples of the Sun. That's what really did it for me, because here's this story about a crew in a spaceship environment that is near absolute zero, so they can get close to the sun and scoop up those golden apples of fusion and bring them back to Earth so we would have peaceful fusion power. And it's totally unscientific and it's ridiculous from one point of view, but it's a beautiful, captivating, motivating, inspiring story. And there's probably not an astronaut or astrophysicist or planetary scientist or aerospace engineer or astronomer who isn't familiar with this story. And it would be one of the Bradbury things that inspired them to go into their careers. So I was inspired and I read him a lot. And of course, then in the Air Force and as a literature professor, I kept reading him. He was high in my science fiction pantheon of writers. but I never thought until the accident of hosting him in 1989 that I would ever meet him or even begin to work with him. Never even dreamed of it.
And he was a pretty approachable guy, I understand. A lot of people have told me I met Ray stories, and a lot of them are, I don't know how to say it, like just quote unquote ordinary people, like who just met him at a con. And I have a good friend who said, oh yeah, I met him at a signing and I mentioned Ireland and he talked about Ireland for 10 minutes. And, you know, everyone has said that he was a very approachable guy.
Oh, absolutely. He was, in many ways, he was a father figure to our imaginations. And just the way he talked. Now, as I approach the age of 70, I'm the age of his children. So, I mean, my father was his generation, and they had the same kind of way of talking. Ray was always so upbeat. You'd say, can we do this now? Should we do this? What do you think of this? He'd say, yeah, sure, swell. Swell. Everything was swell. You know, that was sort of a word for that generation. He was always so positive, and he was always encouraging because, you know, when his breakthrough book, his second book, The Martian Chronicles, is published in 1950, and he sticks it in the hands of Christopher Isherwood, the British, you know, modernist and writer, and was living in Hollywood at the time. And Isherwood was impressed and turned Ray Bradbury over to other friends like Aldous Huxley, who was also living there in LA. And when Ray would see them, they would actually show interest in him. They would encourage him. It was like it wasn't all about them and their famous writing, you know. And that's when Ray realized that he had some talent and he might make it. And these famous guys would encourage him. Ray would do that with fans and readers and other writers at all levels. He would always encourage them. He would always say, love what you do. Don't write about something that you feel you have to write about that'll probably kill you in the writing of it. Write about what you love. He said that about Fahrenheit 451, you know. I didn't write it because I wanted to write a great American novel. I wrote it because I love the story. I wanted to tell the story. And I love that people love it too. He would say he wrote for himself and what he wanted to write, but he was so appreciative of fans, so approachable. You've seen the Comic-Con world out there on the West Coast. You know, he was just so open to people. His autographs are fairly common because he would sign things for everybody. So yes, very approachable and a real wonderful experience for most people.
Yeah, yeah. And so this is something you've actually you went to his house in LA and you've seen his office. And I understand that opening sequence from the TV show, the Ray Bradbury Theater. And for people who are watching this, just look it up on YouTube if you haven't seen it. It shows this, you know, explosion of toys and books and pulps and everything. And you say that really is what his office was like, huh?
Yes, it was, you know, there's little bits of truth in every angle of the history of Ray Bradbury and his office. I mean, you know, a writer he loved, like Edgar Allan Poe, was fascinated with the architecture of our minds, you know, and you see architectures in a lot of his stories. Well, Ray's office was like the architecture of his mind. He would fill it with all the things he loved. Now, there were offices and there were offices, of course, down through time. When he starts out, if I can just do a little quick survey, it's kind of fascinating. He would say super fascinating. That was one of his favorite words. But, you know, he's writing in the little house with his parents in Venice Beach from 42 to 47. He gets married, moves into the little bungalow on the beach with Maggie. That's a little rental duplex. He writes there, but he also still types at that house in the garage back on Venice Boulevard. And when they buy a house in West LA on Clarkson Road, he writes in the garage. His books are in packing crates in the garage, and he types out there because the girls are starting to be born then at that time in the house, and it's quieter in the garage. But the Clarkson Road house then in 58, they moved to the famous house on Cheviot Hills, which is the home office you're talking about, of course. And you know that was his home office for half a century. He did keep an office off Wilshire Boulevard, and then another smaller one in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And a lot of the toys accumulated there. But eventually they all came back to the house. And the toys are important because he sees toys as metaphors, you know? That's the thing that's beautiful about a toy. It can stimulate the imagination. It stands for something that's important to people, you know? Every individual toy has a story. So you would go down into the what you call the upper basement, which is where he set up the home office from the late 50s on, and then on down into the sub basement. You just see toys everywhere, toys that were his and toys that he was given, many toys that he was given in Disney things and such. I started going out in '98 and working in the library in the basement and sort of inventorying his library and a lot of the artifacts. And eventually they came, after he passed away, to the Bradbury Center here in Indiana at the Indiana University. But that office, just like his mind, would move around over time. So if you look at early pictures from the 60s, the office was sort of oriented toward the long side of the rectangle, where his desk would be at one end by the outside wall, and there'd be tables, and then there would be a workbench on the other side of the room that was a built-in, basically. And he had his little desk that he had used back in Venice Beach, would be there. And the girls, the young daughters, the four of them would eventually grow through working at the little desk. He would paint at the little desk. They would paint at the little desk. He would work mostly at the steel desk, Formica top desk there at the far end. Eventually, he turned everything so the orientation had his desk toward the outside wall, where he had gradually closed off the window and the door to the side yard with bookcases built in to the wall. And so that's the look that you see later in life. And we chose, when we brought everything to recreate the Bradbury Center, we chose to orient it that way as it was later in life. The books are in the same kind of random order that he kept them in. We simulated the random order. I cheat a little bit and keep a few books in groups that are good to show people for tours, but generally it's that completely a spontaneous way of putting your book on the shelves that he loved. Now we have more of his artifacts in that area, in that recreated office, because we don't have his den, we don't have his living room where a lot of these things were. So we've concentrated them down there in the recreated office. And if you go to the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies website, you can take a virtual tour and walk yourself through our recreation of his office with its original artifacts.
Ah, cool. Well, that's neat. And hopefully we'll be able to take a real tour again someday. So.
Oh, we hope so.
So. Now, something I've noticed, I wear this t-shirt a lot, and young people, especially people like half my age, like in their 20s, say, oh, I love Ray Bradbury. And, you know, compared to a lot of his contemporaries, he is still read very much by today's high school and college students. What do you suppose is appealing about him to young people?
Well, so many Ray Bradbury readers come to him when they're young. And, of course, that's very shortly after he becomes prominent in the 1940s. Very popular in the pulps, first with weird tales, then with detective fiction. All of it very off-trail stuff. It's his own way of looking at the world from a child's perspective, all the hopes and fears and passions and loves and hates and that we have as children, and how they translate into adult life. And so he was very good at getting around the editors of Weird Tales magazines and other magazines, the detective magazines, doing very unconventional stuff, but it would well up from his imagination, and readers were fascinated with it. Eventually, those readers would give Ray Bradbury to their children to read. And now I think we've gone through 4, and we're probably in the 5th generation of children who are reading him and certainly by junior high school and in high school. Don Albright, again, the consummate collector and Bradbury friend, Don Albright has chronicled, there are at least 1,500, maybe 2,000 textbooks and textbook anthologies, readers, and also commercial anthologies that have published Ray Bradbury stories. And you'll find them used over and over again in schools. Stories like There Will Come Soft Rains or All Summer in a Day. All Summer in a Day, of course, made into a PBS show too. So the children see it at a young age. They grow up and pass it to their children. And his English publishers, for instance, noticed that Ray Bradbury has a loyal following. Even those people who read him young and then grew into middle age or old age, they never forgot him. They didn't need to read him anymore, but they never forgot what he meant to them once. Right after his stroke in November 1999, when he recovered enough to get back on the road, he came to Indianapolis, and we had lunch with him and went to a session with him when he spoke at Butler University. And in that big auditorium in Clues Hall, very large auditorium, I looked around the night he came to talk, and Douglas Adams was there too to talk with him. And the people were there for Bradbury, and they brought their children. Most of them were middle-aged or younger parents, and they had their children there because this was a chance to see the man who could give us his dreams, his fantasies, and his desire to go to other worlds. So it's a very generational thing. He is versatile, he's prolific, and the best of his stories still resonate and still get republished.
Yeah. I remember reading one of his stories before I even knew who he was. I read The Coffin when I was like in the 8th grade or something. I thought, wow, that was cool. And that sounds like a pretty impressive lineup, Douglas Adams and Ray Bradbury. That must have been a packed hall. So
it really was. And Douglas Adams did his usual thing where he would read from his books because he was good at reading with the same kind of sardonic humor that's in his books. But Ray would get up and he would talk, and it would just come from the heart, and he would just pour it out, write every day, even if it's no good, write, and you will get better, just as he did over those early years as well.
Okay, yeah. So let's see, what have I got here? So Fahrenheit 451, interestingly, is the only book that he referred to as science fiction. Otherwise, he pretty much referred to himself as a fantasy writer. That was something that was important to him. Why do you suppose that distinction was important, that he was a fantasy writer, not a science fiction writer?
I think that goes back to those early days of publishing in the pulps. So from the time his first story that he's paid for is published in a professional magazine, The Pendulum, in November 1941, I think it's in Super Science Stories. From then on, he is reaching out and experimenting with all the genre pulps, okay? Because you have that explosion of them in the late 30s. There are a lot of science fiction, fantasy, detective fiction pulps. Some of them are holdovers from earlier times. And of course, the war curtails a lot of them. Because of the paper rationing, many of them, the monthlies would go to quarterlies, the quarterlies would go, to biannuals. And so, and some of them disappeared completely. So he's in competition with all the older writers, and the publishers can just sort of dictate the terms. So he's making basically a penny a word with Weird Tales. And the pattern there was he liked his editors like Dorothy McElrath and Monty Buchanan and the other editors he worked with. He had issues with the publishers who were there to make money. And so, a penny a word, he's beginning to write some pretty good stuff, especially in the fantasy and Weird Tales and even the detective pulp stuff. But it's not orthodox. He did not want to write to genre traditional rules. He respected them. He read those writers. That's, part of his world. But he did his own thing. He made a bargain with his own mind, not to be self-conscious. That's an enemy of so many writers in the first draft, isn't it? To be self-conscious. So he would try and get a story out on paper fast, use word association to come up with a topic, and let the characters write the story. And he would say that over and over again down through time. Let the characters write the stories. Well, of course, that's impossible. And of course, he knows that's impossible, but it's a deal he makes. He wants his conscious mind just basically to butt out and let whatever comes up from the subconscious write the tale. Well, some strange stories ended up, and they weren't the normal vampire stories, and they weren't the normal ghost stories that Weird Tales wanted, but they kept accepting them. They'd say, and Ray's agent, Julia Schwartz, later, of course, very prominent in DC Comics, would say, okay, Ray, we need more stories, and no more of that kid stuff. Write real ghost stories, write real vampire stories. So he felt the pressure, and he slanted when he had to early on, but he hated it. And he hated genre labels because really he wrote outside of all of them. But he also wanted these kinds of stories in the science fiction too, to rise up into the literary mainstream. And very unintentionally, in writing his own kind of science fiction, which some people would say really wasn't science fiction at all, it was stories of the human heart that were set in sort of the armature of a science fiction plot. But he was one of the people who literally raised it all into the literary mainstream. So he was very touchy about labels. He was sort of a neo-romanticist. He was sort of, there's a lot of romance and sentiment in his stories, and he could keep the balance a lot of the time. Sometimes he couldn't, and the stories would be too sentimental or too much purple prose. And he knew that, but he thought that kind of high emotion had to be there, regardless of the genre. He allowed Fahrenheit to be called his science fiction work, although he really called it, sometimes he'd call it sociological fiction, because it's about what do we do in a world like Huxley's Brave New World, that you appear to have all kinds of entertainment, so what's wrong? Well, what's wrong is you can never learn, you can never grow, because your past, in the form of the books and the literature, has been taken away from you. And so he allowed that to be called science fiction. And the Martian Chronicles, he was pretty firm about that's not science fiction. Science fiction, one of his very basic definitions was science fiction considers the future of the possible. Fantasy rejoices in the impossible and takes us down very creative, imaginative tales and into ideas that will never be in reality. But the Martian Chronicles, he felt, was really more fantasy. Perhaps some of the stories are magical realism. Of course, the Martian Chronicles, again, is a mirror of how we behave on Earth. Will we behave that way on Mars? So he didn't like to be pigeonholed in any of these genre categories at all.
Yeah. And I think even Fahrenheit, it seems to be kind of fantasy. I mean, it's not necessarily, I don't think he ever thought that was going to happen someday. It was kind of more of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of a metaphor, sort of a fairy tale of, a world where people don't read. But yeah, but I always thought he was, in the Martian Chronicles, he knew, of course, Mars does not really have a breathable atmosphere and all that. It's really a fantasy world. But okay, so I think I'm kind of at the end of my list of questions. So do you have like any favorite stories of Ray or any favorite anecdotes? I'm sure you've got a million of them, but.
Well, when I met him, I was in my late 30s. I was approaching the end of my 20-year Air Force career, and I already had a PhD, and I had by then had moved all the way from operational assignments in the Tactical Air Command and in the Pacific Air Forces to academic work. So I was in uniform still, but I was teaching at the Air Force Academy, and my last assignment would be teaching at the Naval Academy. And then in 1993, when I retired, that's when I came to Indiana University, the IUPUI campus at Indianapolis. And I thought my life was mapped out for me, and I thought I had seen a lot of things in the military and had a lot of experiences. And I never thought I'd grow any wiser than I was by the time I was 41 years old. Well, Ray Bradbury changed all that. There would be things that he would say that would just make you wonder or make you smile. I remember one that makes you wonder and think about it when in 1989, one day when we were at that conference, it was time to go into the first large public session, and he was there. The other guests were fantastic science fiction writers, Octavia Butler, David Brin, Joe Haldeman, and Ray was sitting there in the middle. And of course, it gets open to questions, and a lot of the people are going to target Ray for their questions. And the first kid is a young boy with big round glasses, reminded me of Milhouse from The Simpsons, okay? And he raises his hand and he says, "Mr. Bradbury, I want to know how we should think of you after you're dead." And everybody is going, "Oh no." And I'm sitting there in the back of the room going, "Oh boy, this is going to be a long session." And Ray just looks down over his glasses well, really through his glasses, but he looks down over the table at the young man. He says, "Oh son, you don't understand. When I die, you will all disappear." And that's one of those moments like, wow, he is such a part of our imagination. Not only with his stories, not only with his books, but with the adaptations of his work to Ray Bradbury Theater and to The Twilight Zone and many episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. I mean, you would hear phrases on TV shows like, "This is beginning to sound like a Ray Bradbury story." You hear that in at least one episode of The Twilight Zone, and you hear it decades later in at least one episode of West Wing, you know? So he's every once in a while, you get so used to having him in your heart from reading that you have to stop and think, wow, what would the world be like without him? And how much of our worldview is in his dreams? Another interesting story was, I think when I was out working at the house in 1998, we went out to Palm Springs, as we usually would try to do during those weeks. And we had a weekend home. And I was working there in his files out there, and he was writing at that time he was writing a chapter for Let's All Kill Constance, the third of his detective novels that he did late in life that were really very autobiographical novels about his early years as a writer, as you know. And at the end of the day, we got in Pat Kaczurka's car. Pat drove for him and worked for him for many years. And we started to go home, and he turns to me and he says, "Well, how'd it go for you today?" And I sort of went through I was retired. I was long retired by then, but I went through my military briefing. I said, "Well, I did this and I did that and I found this. And did you know that you still did this and that you have this?" And I'd say, "Overall, it was a good day, Ray." And he just looked down at me in the car and he said, "Every day's a good day, Jon. Every day's a good day." And I've never forgotten that since he told me.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for spending some time with me, and I look forward to the reopening of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies, and hopefully I'll get to see it in person again real soon. So thanks, because I know you've got a busy schedule, and I'll post this and I'll let you know when I've got this edited and some more details there. So, but thank you very much.
I appreciate the chance, Ordy. You've been a great fan and friend to the Bradbury Center and the initiatives in Waukegan. Take care.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks. Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.